Welcome to our webinar presented by Tom Bellinson, Principal of IT Methods. Mr. Bellinson has been providing business process and enterprise software consulting services to manufacturers and distributors for over 15 years. Today he will be speaking to us about improved inventory management. Questions are encouraged. Please utilize the questions section to type them in. We extend our special thanks to IT Methods for presenting. And now let's begin.
Well, now that we've got the technical glitches out of the way, I'd like to thank everybody, and especially the Michigan Manufacturers Association for all their good works in the manufacturing community. And I hope to be part of that this morning by helping you get some understanding of inventory management and how you can drive some cash to the bottom line with good inventory management practices. I'm going to start off by just doing some review and some basics about inventory management. And we're going to talk about how inventory tends to build up in an organization. And we'll spend some time talking about forecasting, as that's a real critical piece of inventory management. And then finish up by talking about supply chain management and then just how to stay on top of things on an ongoing basis. And I promise you this will be the most boring slide that I have to offer you today. Let's start with a little review of inventory management. I'm a process guy, business process guy, and so I tend to think maybe a little bit more differently about processes than some. And a lot of people think of inventory management as a process, but in fact, it's actually a series of processes that are all interconnected in what we call a value chain. So each process feeds the next. And what you're looking at here is a typical value chain for inventory management. It begins with purchasing, and that includes, of course, all the activities associated with acquiring inventory. And then the next step would be receiving, which is both physical receipt of the product as well as the systems sort of receiving of it and getting it into your inventory management system, assuming that you have one. The next step is, of course, putting it away. And sometimes inventory will go into storage. Sometimes it may get put straight into the production area. And sometimes it will not get put away. It's something called cross-docking, where essentially it stays on the dock and gets prepared to be shipped back out. Manufacturers rarely do this. So this is something that's more common to commercial warehouses. Now, if you're a manufacturer, which I'm assuming everybody here is, the next step is going to be to issue materials. And issuing materials is both a system level thing where material gets allocated to production, and it can also be the physical act of taking the inventory from storage and bringing it to the production area. And of course that material is used for manufacturing, and the finished product then has to be received in inventory as inventory items. And again, this is both a systems process and a physical process, which could include put away of the product back into storage or brought to the dock as part of the picking process. And then finally it would get packaged up and shipped. Now these two processes sometimes are so intertwined that they're not really separate processes. It's during this time where often customer invoicing is done, and so that's conceivably another process that's commingled in this process of getting product shipped out the door. At the very least, you'll have a packing slip of some sort that has to be produced, and then, of course, the labeling and preparation for the carrier, bills of lading, and that sort of thing. So that's all part of the end process. Now, this, again, is what we would call a value chain, where one activity feeds the other. This does not represent everything that has to do with inventory management. There are some processes that are not part of that value chain but are still important. There's physical counting, and there's really two types of physical counting. There's the full physical count. Technically, I guess you could say there's three, because there's another one called visual counting, where people go out and just look to see how much of something they have. And this is the kind of counting that people that don't have accurate inventory do all the time. They're going out to see what they actually have because they don't trust their data. The other kind of counting is cycle counting, where you're counting all of your inventory, but you're doing it over a longer period of time in small chunks. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But that's a very efficient way to do counting, and it's also a very good way to make sure that your inventory remains accurate so you don't have to do those visual counts. And then, of course, there's adjustments. Adjustments often happen as a result of counting, but they can happen for a variety of other reasons. A product becomes damaged or just lost. And then finally, inventory valuation. This is something that the bean counters are very cognizant of. And how you value your inventory can actually have quite a big impact on, for example, how much your inventory is worth for example, borrowing purposes as collateral. So that's something that you need to take a look at. If you haven't looked at it in a while, you're allowed to change your valuation method for tax purposes once every 6 or 7 years, I believe. And so that's something that's worth evaluating. So let's get into it and talk about how inventory gets built up. And this is a problem for a lot of companies, and it happens at various stages. And of course, if we follow the value chain, the first step is purchasing. And a lot of inventory buildup can happen right here for a wide variety of reasons. Sometimes it's could be laid at the doorstep of the purchasing folks and making errors, but a lot of times it's just things that happen that are out of your control to some degree. One of the things that is within the control of purchasing that is very enticing, and this is in particular true of companies that have materials that are very that are commodities. I've done considerable work with plastic injection molders, and they buy resin, and you'll see here that I put a graph of resin prices, and you'll see they change very dramatically, and it's very tempting to stock up when the prices are low, and there's good reason to do that to some degree, but there's a lot of costs associated with holding inventory. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but it's important to understand a balance between the cost of holding inventory and taking advantage of possible material savings on the front end. So these are things that we'll just want to look at as we go through in evaluating why we've allowed the inventory to build up. There may be some good reasons for it. Now, in receiving, people often don't think that receiving is an area where inventory buildup can occur, but it's very critical that receiving is something that's done accurately, because suppliers are not perfect, and sometimes they have mistakes, and sometimes the purchasing folks have mistakes. And these mistakes, if they're not caught in receiving, they end up as inventory buildup. So good product inspection is important, good paperwork, good supplier integration, and we'll talk more about how to mitigate some of these problems when we talk about supply chain management. Now, put away seems like probably the least likely area in which inventory buildup can occur. When I was putting this presentation together, I was searching the internet for a picture of a disorganized warehouse. and I never found one quite as disorganized as a warehouse that I saw in Iowa City, in which the aisleways they had so much product in the warehouse that they were sticking it everywhere, and the aisleways had actually become curved, and it was a very difficult warehouse to stay in because the lift trucks had to honk constantly because they were going around corners all the time, and there were no long straight aisles to look down. And we were looking for product in this warehouse, and we found areas that were inaccessible to the lift trucks. Matter of fact, they were barely accessible to a human. We had to slide sideways between skids to get to some areas, and we found inventory that had been sitting there for 2 years and nobody knew about it. That was obviously an extreme example, but when inventory gets blocked in or hard to get at, and it also becomes difficult to find, and so when you go to do picking, you can't find the inventory, and at some point the material handlers just give up. And when they do that, you order more inventory that you don't actually need, and this is just another form of inventory buildup. So forecasting technically is not part of the inventory management value chain, but it's a very important input to the inventory processes. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about forecasting. It actually drives a lot of the operation in terms of planning, capacity planning, production planning, material planning, all derive their inputs from forecasting. Now, there are two kinds of forecasting. There's dependent demand, which technically doesn't need to be forecasted because it's a mathematical model. And then there's independent demand, and that's the demand that comes from the marketplace. So just to clarify, when you're looking at the sources of demand, independent demand would be like if I'm making a widget and I need 5 thingies to make a widget, and I want to make 5 widgets, then I know I'm going to need 25 thingies. And that's just a mathematical formula, and I don't need to do anything too fancy. Your ERP system can handle that. With independent demand, it's a little trickier. And if you don't get that right, then you're going to end up building up inventory. So let's talk about forecasting. And one of the reasons that forecasting has become even more critical is we're all trying to operate more in a more lean fashion, and that means reducing inventory levels down to bare necessity, and that leaves you very little wiggle room if you get it wrong. So what's important when you're in a lean environment is having as long of a planning horizon as you can, and not just long, but also as accurate as possible. So you really need to make sure that you're using all the tools at your disposal to extend your planning horizon as far as possible. Now, if you're lucky enough to have stable demand, then you can pretty much rely on dependent demand-driven material forecasts and pull systems, and your ERP system should be able to handle this. And about that, if you don't think that your ERP system does forecasting, then either there's unfound capability there that you're not aware of, or you don't actually have an ERP, because ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning, and forecasting is a central component of that. So it's something that some companies underutilize, but it's a very important component of the ERP. And if you have predictable demand, then you can use sales forecasting tools that also should be within your ERP system, along with pull systems to manage your demand and to extend your planning horizon. Now there are some companies that are job shops or project-based shops that have very unpredictable demand. And if you're one of those folks, then the key to making your inventory as light as possible is going to be focusing on your supply chain and focusing on the time it takes you from when you get an order to when you get it to manufacturing. Anytime you can squeeze time out of the front of the manufacturing process is how you can get your inventory levels down. A lot of companies like Alro Steel will deliver product the next day, even the same day in the afternoon if you order it in the morning in some cases. So there are ways to get your inventory levels down and rely on your supply chain. So let's kind of look at some of these the two scenarios in which independent demand must be forecasted. If you have relatively stable demand and you're getting that information through your supply chain, then the key is to work as closely with your supply chain as you possibly can. I don't know if any of you have ever played a simulation game called the beer game, and it simulates a beer supply chain. There are 4 members of this supply chain: the party stores and distributors of the retail sellers of the beer. There are distributors that distribute a wide range of products, wholesalers, and then of course the manufacturers. So there's 4 elements. In the first round of this game, each member of the supply chain only speaks to their direct customer. So they only know the demand that's given to them by their direct customer. And that means the manufacturer doesn't know anything about the demand that's coming from the retailer until it's worked its way through the supply chain from the wholesaler who they sell to. And in this game, almost invariably in round 1, everybody ends up with huge buildup of inventory. In round 2, they open it up so that now everybody can talk to everybody. So now the manufacturer can know what the retailer is reporting for demand as soon as they report it out. And that gives them that extra lead time to be able to plan. It extends their planning horizon. And this is really important to get your supply chain opened up where you're getting data as soon as it's available from the farthest out member of the supply chain, hopefully from the people that are selling to consumers on the other end of it. If you are more of a job shop where you're dealing with individual sales, then you need to have a defined forecasting method. And having a good customer relationship management system can really help with this. A lot of ERP systems have those built in now. If they don't, you can get a separate one and feed the data into the ERP system from the separate CRM. But one of the tools that I've used, and it's worked really well for me over the years, is just listing out the sales, estimated amount of the sale, and the probability of close. And if anyone's interested, I do have a standard definition I use for these percentages. And what they allow you to do is use that percentage of close as a multiplier against the amount of the sale to get a forecasted amount. And if you have more than a few sales forecasted, this method has, at least for me and the people I know who've used it, an excellent track record of being a very accurate assessment of how much you can expect to sell in any given forecasting period. Now, I know that I probably sound a little like a butcher telling you to eat more meat. But an ERP system is really a critical tool in helping you keep your inventory levels down. Because if you put good forecast data into your ERP, that's going to feed your material requirements planning component. And there again, inside the MRP, you need to have good data. You need to have good vendor pricing data that's up to date. You need to have good product lead time data in there so that the system really knows the variables to do the calculations that it's capable of doing. But if you put the right data in the system and you keep it up to date, what you get out are purchase orders that are really optimized to keep your inventory levels down as low as they can possibly be, and also to keep the cost of those purchases down as well. So let's spend some time now talking about the supply chain, because you can only do so much to keep the cost of inventory down internally. Obviously, you can keep the amount of inventory you have down, but you still, even there, can get some help from the supply chain. And when we look at the cost of inventory, there's something called landed cost, which is different for different companies. What we try to do with landed cost is add the cost of other things like storing the inventory or handling the inventory, and of course freight. These are the three most common components of a landed cost. These other things on here, sometimes people refer to them in a formula for total cost of inventory. And they're a little bit harder in some cases to quantify. But if you get inventory that has bad quality, I think we all know, those of us who are in manufacturing, that can be very costly, especially if those parts find their way into your finished product and that causes you quality problems with your customers. The other thing that happens is with engineering, when you continue to make changes, and those repeated changes can complicate things and force you in some cases to have additional inventory. So all these things combine to either reduce or create more cost within your inventory framework. So let's talk a little bit about freight. My wife works for Whole Foods Market, and there's a big campaign in the food world to buy local. But this can be no more true than in the manufacturing world, because if you're getting product from a local supplier, your freight costs are lower. I've done a lot of work also in the paper industry, and paper has a low weight to cost ratio, which means that the cost of freight is a high portion of the overall cost of the paper. And everybody tries to play a little game of hide the weenie in pretending that there's no freight cost there, but it's always there. If somebody is paying for the shipping, it's ultimately going to be on the back of the customer to pay that, because whoever's selling it has to sell it profitably, and they're not going to eat the cost of freight. So you bring the cost down by being local. And of course, with good forecasting and accurate inventory, you eliminate a lot of the need to expedite freight, which can be very expensive, especially if you have to put things in the air that were supposed to be coming via ground. And then finally, you want to look at software. If your ERP doesn't have this software, it's worth looking at other tools that are out there that allow you to quickly assess freight. Now, sometimes the freight costs are tacked on by your suppliers, and it's worth looking at this, even if that's the case, to make sure they're getting good freight rates. because you are paying for it, regardless of whether it's baked into the price of the product or not. Now, anybody who's involved in purchasing knows that the relationship that we have with our vendors is getting more and more complex. Lean manufacturing principles encourage us to have fewer suppliers that we have stronger relationships with. And this is a good idea to a point, but in order to reduce risk, it's a good idea to have several suppliers for each major material line that you need, and not to just have them in reserve, but to use them so that you can continue to experience their performance and make sure that they're living up to the standards that you need them to. And a lot of systems have a supplier scorecard. If they don't have one, you could do it in Excel. But if your system has a supplier scorecard mechanism in it, it's often useful because it'll actually collect data from transactions. And for example, if you do dock audits of incoming material, it will record those scores of those dock audits and apply them to the vendor scorecard. So what this allows you to do is to keep track of these other costs that are associated with your inventory and make sure that your vendor isn't actually costing you more. They may be the low price vendor, but if they're creating quality issues or timing issues or engineering issues, any of these things are going to add cost, possibly in other processes, but they are nonetheless inventory-related costs. And one of the ways in which you can reduce some of these costs is by looking at how your supplier can connect with your processes. This is one area, for example, that is an obvious one, is their shipping process and your receiving process. Their shipping process is a direct input to your receiving process. And so they're part of that value chain, and if they connect properly, then you're going to have a smooth, accurate receiving process. One way that they can do that is by producing shipping labels on their product that are easy for your receiving people to use to accurately receive the product. Another area that is very powerful in terms of its ability to keep costs down is vendor-managed inventory. Now, vendor-managed inventory can mean different things to different people, but there are two major components to it. One is that the vendor takes responsibility for keeping inventory levels under control without creating stockouts. And so they recognize the need to do that effectively in order to remain a vendor, and it puts the onus on them to do that. The other thing that's maybe even more valuable is what's known as invoice on use. And this gets handled a couple different ways. Some vendors use systems like the one you see pictured here, where they actually have a vending machine that dispenses product and keeps track of what you've used as you use it. And other vendors will do what's known as a surveillance physical inventory, where they come in and each period they count what you have and deduct what you had at the start of the period and to get how much you consumed. And then they invoice you for what you've used. And that has the benefit of allowing you to have a little bit extra inventory on hand without paying for it. So these are options that are very important for critical things like tooling and critical materials that you use a lot of. And so you should really be looking at these vendor managed inventory scenarios in these critical situations. And if your vendors don't provide them, you may want to look for vendors that do provide them because they're out there. So finally, let's talk about staying on top of the inventory that you have. Assuming now that you've got, you're working on reducing your buildup and you're getting your supply chain to be as efficient as possible, now you have to really work on keeping your inventory accurate, because an accurate inventory is necessary for everything to work. And a good warehouse management system is going to really go a long way to helping you do that, because what it does is it puts the actual inventory data collection in the hands of the people that work with the material every day. And these are the folks that actually suffer directly when inventory isn't accurate, because they're the ones that have to go find it and get it. And if they know that if they do this right, it makes their job easier. And so one of the keys to doing that is proper labeling and tracking of each container that the inventory is in. And barcodes have been around for a long time. They're almost free. They're inexpensive, and a lot of times you can get your suppliers to barcode their labels. So all you need to do is read it. If they don't barcode printers are cheap. You can even use laser printers now for labels, and you can get those barcodes on your product so that they're easy to track. In an ideal world, the folks out in the warehouse never have to type anything. Every time you have to type something, you risk making a mistake. Barcodes are a way to avoid data entry errors. A lot of people have looked at RFID tags, and there are a lot of products now that are coming with RFID tags. RFID tags are obviously more expensive, but they also have problems in that they're easily, the signal that the tag generates, especially on the inexpensive tags, they're called passive tags, and the passive tag relies on a signal that's generated by the reader that bounces back from the tag. Well, if the antenna on the tag is blocked by either liquid or metal, or and when I say liquid, it could be a high moisture content in a cardboard box, could be enough to block a signal. And of course, the tags could be on a product that's in a box, that's in another box, that's on a skid, that's wrapped in plastic, and so there's a lot of barriers between that tag and the reader. And because of this, what we've found is that most people are using RFID tags at the skid level, and they're using them in conjunction with advanced shipping notifications to say, this is what's on the skid. Not a good tool for receiving, because there's no validation without being able to read all the tags that what was supposed to be on that skid is actually on there, unless of course it's a single large item or a few large items. So just be aware that in your environment, RFID tags may work great, or they may not. I mentioned cycle counting earlier, and I wanted to come back to that. Cycle counting is a great way to maintain inventory accuracy without expending huge amounts of time on a big project. The idea behind it, and this is again something that any warehouse management system should have the ability to handle. Many ERP systems now have integrated warehouse management. is that you count in small batches over a period of time. So maybe 2 or 3 times a week you spend 15 or 20 minutes doing smaller counts, but over the course of time you count everything. And the other element of cycle counting that's important is that it turns out that in most cases 80% of your inventory turnover is from 20% of your stock keeping units, the different types of materials that you have. And so you can avoid counting the lower value or the lower turnover items as frequently with cycle counting by coding all of your product in an ABC classification. And again, this really does keep the cost of inventory accuracy down. If you're not doing cycle counting now, it's something worth looking at. So essentially, if we were to look back on this presentation, the message here is to start by making sure your forecasts are as accurate and as far out into the future as you can make them. Use your ERP system to take advantage of those forecasts. Look at all the different ways that inventory is building up in your system. Find the root cause and stamp it out. And then engage your supply chain and work closely with your vendors to reduce costs. And if they're not cutting the mustard, look for new vendors. And don't just look at the lowest price. Make sure you're looking at the total cost of that inventory. And finally, using a warehouse management system is going to go a long way to help you maintaining the accuracy of your inventory, which is so critical to making everything else work. So before we go into the Q&A, I had one last thought. I was reading a paper on system dynamics the other day, and I came across this paragraph, and it reminded me that no matter how much information you gather about what you should be doing, making those changes is the most difficult part of the process. A lot of times people are open to new ideas and they understand them and they agree with them, but as the paragraph closes here, under pressure of daily operations, decisions would revert to prior practice. You have to rail against the prior practice. If your inventory levels are too high right now, it means you have to change your behavior. And so I leave you with that thought. And I would like to open it up now to any questions. I would also add that if you're interested, on my website, I have a complete ebook on inventory management. It goes into much more detail than I have here about all the different aspects of inventory management, including racking and other types of material handling equipment. So feel free to go out there and grab a copy of that if you'd like. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much for presenting, and thank you to our attendees for this webinar. We look forward to connecting with you at future MMA webinars.